overwhelming me as I talked because of the emotion that by the end of that last paragraph, I can still remember. I had to punch each word and syllable out to the base of my stomach with my muscles to get it out. Some wounds never heal, especially those from loved ones. Charles Spencer kept quiet for decades to honor his sister's memory. A long-hidden secret about King Charles has been revealed. Diana's brother is visibly frightened, and others think he's changed since. What could be so awful to break his silence after 30 years? Discover Princess Diana's brother's breakdown after uncovering King Charles's long-hidden secret. Brother's Quest. A royal archives request started it all. The royal family welcomed Charles Spencer to Sandringham House in Norfolk in early 2023. Though he had been numerous times, this time felt different. Queen Elizabeth II died in September 2022, prompting a review of confidential archives. Charles Spencer was allowed to view Diana's death and memorial arrangements as her only brother. Royal archives are spread out. Most royal records are maintained at Windsor Castle in Kew, but sensitive ones, especially those related to the family, are often preserved in safe, lesser-known locations. A sealed vault in Sandringham's private wing near the library is one example. The monarch had kept decades of confidential conversations in this estate. Charles was led by an unnamed senior official to a short corridor with locked cabinets. Few were tagged for his review. One read D 1997-98. The label drew his notice immediately because those were Diana's last years. The drawer had a cream-colored folder with a blue ribbon. Charles opened it cautiously. He found a letter. 7 months after Diana's death in August 1997, it was dated March 1998. Charles Windsor signed at the bottom. Prince Charles, now King Charles III, wrote to Sir Robert Fellows, the Queen's former private secretary and Diana's brother-in-law. Initial worry and diplomacy were evident. As Charles read farther, the tone altered. The letter included explicit directions. It ordered the permanent preservation of Diana's leather-bound diaries and cassette tapes from her final months. Princes William and Harry cannot access it yet. In his own words, the prince justified the materials as emotionally unstable and unhelpful to the boy's upbringing. Charles Spencer froze. He reread the letter. Since Diana left messages, the tapes brought back recollections. On Diana, her true story, her 1992 biography, Diana worked closely with journalist Andrew Morton. She had recorded hours of tapes about her palace life, melancholy, worries, and love for her sons. However, these were new cassettes, not previously published. The letter says these were recorded confidentially and never published. They and the journal were stored at Kensington Palace and moved into royal possession after her death, perhaps under Sir Michael Peat, Charles's then principal private secretary. The phrasing was planned. Indefinitely sealed. Not until William and Harry became 18, married, or asked. That meant forever. Charles Spencer sat startled. He gave Diana's Westminster Abbey eulogy. He boldly promised that her blood family would shield William and Harry from the forces that wrecked her. He discovered years later that Diana's final voice had been protected by the institution she most feared. Even worse, her sons didn't know. No public document mentioned these cassettes or journal. No sign Diana's final words to her boys were hidden. Charles Spencer realized then that something had been hidden intentionally. He stood up after gently putting the letter back in the folder. This action silenced Diana and prevented her children from hearing her last words. And the throne holder signed it. Charles Spencer took the sealed letter to Althorpe, the Spencer family estate in Northamptonshire. Charles buried Diana on a little island in an oval lake on the estate where she spent her childhood. Charles was alone in his study, staring at the envelope on his desk, feeling like he had failed. The words in that letter resonated in his thoughts, locked forever and unavailable to William and Harry. He kept thinking about Diana's last year. When they talked privately, she told him bits and pieces. He remembered late-night calls where she cried, whispered, and admitted to feeling trapped. She feared her comments would be buried with her body after death. "If something happens to me, I need the boys to know how much I love them," she remarked. He was troubled by the sentence. Charles slept poorly at Althorpe. He read Diana's early marital letters while Diana's memorial candle burned beside him. Some were glad, excited about William's birth. Her isolation in the palace, fear of Camilla, and growing skepticism that her voice mattered were cruelly described. Depression, remorse, and indignation followed. He remembered his 1997 world-famous passage from her eulogy. "We, your blood family, will do all we can to continue the imaginative and loving way in which you were steering these two exceptional young men." Now he wasn't sure he had done that. Diana had wanted to be heard, not just by the world, but by her sons. And Charles Spencer had trusted the institution that had once broken her to do the right thing. He had assumed they would protect her legacy. Instead, they had hidden it. In that moment, Charles grieved for the promises he couldn't keep. But what exactly did Diana say that made the palace so desperate to keep them hidden? Keep watching because what is coming next would change everything. Diana's voice. The following morning, with formal permission arranged through a private request to royal archivists, he traveled to a discreet facility near Windsor where certain high-security items tied to the monarchy were held. Unlike public royal collections, these were off-limits to historians and press. Access required not just clearance, but a justification. Charles had both. Inside a sealed compartment, a royal custodian handed him a black leather box. On it was embossed Diana's former royal cipher, a small golden crest. He opened it carefully. Inside, wrapped in tissue and sealed in protective casing, were 4 cassette tapes, each labeled in Diana's handwriting. Alongside them, bound in navy blue, was a slim journal with a ribbed spine. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Diana's. Charles sat down in the review room, placed the first tape into a player, and pressed play. Her voice filled the room, soft, measured, and personal. She was speaking freely. The first few minutes were full of reflection. She spoke about her marriage, about how she entered the royal family at 19, completely unprepared for what lay ahead. Then the pain began to surface. She spoke of her loneliness, of crying at night in Kensington Palace, and how quickly she felt replaced once Camilla re-entered the picture. "I tried to be the perfect princess," she said in one part, her voice trembling. "But I wasn't what they wanted, and I couldn't pretend anymore." Charles took notes. But then the tone of the tape changed. Diana began talking about William and Harry. She spoke about their smiles, their closeness, their innocence. "They are my light," she said softly. "My reason for waking up, my strength." But she also spoke with fear. "I worry about the palace turning them into something they're not, about them growing up in the same cage I lived in." She didn't name people directly, but her frustration with how decisions were made was clear. She feared the boys would be used, shaped, and spun into royal figures without the emotional tools to survive it. In the journal, the same theme repeated. There were entries written late at night, sometimes in anger, sometimes in sadness. Some days she wrote to herself, other days she wrote as if speaking to William and Harry directly. "I want you to know the truth," one entry read, "not what they'll write in history books, but how I really felt, what I saw, what I feared." She even referenced Camilla, though rarely by name. One entry read, "Will be efforts to make what happened look neat and tidy, like it was always meant to be." But it wasn't. And I hope you'll remember who spoke up for you when no one else did. For Charles Spencer, this was devastating. Hearing her speak, reading her words, it was like she had reached out from beyond the grave to remind him of what she needed. He realized the tapes and journal weren't volatile because of what they said about Charles or Camilla. They were volatile because they gave Diana back her unfiltered and raw voice. And someone had decided that voice was too dangerous to be heard. But Charles was beginning to believe the opposite. What if it was time the world finally heard her? Charles Spencer knew he couldn't carry the weight of this discovery alone. After listening to all 4 tapes and reading every line of Diana's journal, the silence became unbearable. The palace had hidden his sister's final words not just from the public, but from her own sons. That was something he could no longer accept. So just days after reviewing the materials, Charles requested a private meeting with King Charles at Clarence House. The request wasn't formal, and there was no press involved. This was a conversation between 2 men who had once been family, now tied only by the ghost of the woman they had both lost. The meeting was held behind closed doors. Charles Spencer came in holding the original letter signed by the king in 1998. He placed it on a small table between them and asked one simple question. Why? King Charles, according to sources familiar with the conversation, didn't deny writing the letter. He claimed it was a difficult decision made in the chaos following Diana's death. He said he feared the content of her tapes and journal would further traumatize William and Harry, who were still teenagers. Charles Spencer didn't accept that. He argued that the decision wasn't about protection. It was about control. Diana's voice had always been inconvenient to the palace. And now, even in death, it had been silenced. The conversation became tense. King Charles defended his judgment. Charles Spencer accused him of betrayal. The gulf between them grew wider with each word. The meeting ended with Charles standing, visibly shaken, and walking out without shaking the king's hand. He knew what he had to do next. That same evening, Charles contacted Prince William. They hadn't spoken very much in months, but this time was different. He explained what he had found. At first, William thought it was some archival note or family letter. But when Charles told him it was a message from Diana recorded in her own voice, William went quiet. They arranged to meet privately. Charles played just 2 minutes from one of the tapes. Diana spoke softly about how proud she was of William and Harry, how she feared the palace would reshape them, how she hoped one day they would hear her truth. William couldn't speak. He lowered his head and stayed silent for a long time. The next day, Charles sent a secure copy of the materials to Harry in Montecito. Harry responded through a short voice note. His words were simple. "Thank you for not keeping this from me." For the first time in a long time, both brothers stood on the same emotional ground as Diana's sons. But while the discovery brought them closer, it also reopened the deep wound of their loss and the feeling that someone else had decided how much of their mother they were allowed to remember. And as the contents of the tape slowly began to sink in, the question became even bigger. What exactly did Diana say that terrified the palace so much? Keep watching, because what comes next would force the royal family into a corner they can't easily escape from. Power of Truth. Charles Spencer listened to the remaining tapes again, this time with a notepad in hand. He marked down exact quotes. Diana spoke at length about Camilla, not in jealousy, but in disappointment, noting how quickly her husband's attention shifted, how decisions were made without her input, and how she was seen more as a symbol than a human being. She said, "I feared that woman would one day be part of the boys' lives, and that they'd be told to accept it. But my truth matters too. My story must not disappear." And that's exactly what the palace had tried to do. Charles Spencer could see it clearly now. The reason these tapes were locked away was because they were powerful. They told the side of the story the monarchy had worked hard to reshape. The version where Charles III found redemption, where Camilla was rehabilitated in the public eye, where Diana became a memory, not a voice. But this journal and these tapes changed all of that. Inside the journal, Diana wrote openly about her hopes for her sons to be loved but not controlled. She worried they'd grow up thinking her story was just tabloid drama. "Please remember," one entry read, "I never stopped trying to protect you even when I wasn't allowed to." When Charles Spencer shared this section with William, the prince was speechless. He finally understood what had been taken from him, not just his mother's presence, but her truth. Meanwhile, inside the palace, word of the discovery began to leak. The king's senior advisors were briefed. No one was quite sure how far Charles Spencer would go. And then came the worry about Camilla. If Diana's words were ever released publicly, the new queen consort's position could come under renewed scrutiny. Some parts of Diana's journal directly questioned Camilla's influence and the royal family's willingness to look the other way. The fear inside the palace wasn't just about reputation. It was about narrative control. Everything they'd spent decades rebuilding could unravel in one audio clip. But Charles Spencer wasn't thinking about that. Charles Spencer had carried many titles in his life: author, earl, historian, but none ever felt as heavy as the keeper of Diana's final voice. In the days after his confrontation with the king and the emotional moments shared with William and Harry, Charles kept returning to the same question. What would Diana have wanted? Not just in theory, but in truth. She had spoken clearly in her tapes and journals. She didn't want to be forgotten. She didn't trust the system. She feared that silence would bury her story while others rewrote it. Charles knew her well enough to understand that she didn't leave those recordings just for her sons. She left them to be heard because she no longer could speak for herself. And so slowly but deliberately, Charles began to act. He first arranged legal advice. The materials technically remained part of the royal estate, but Diana had authored them. And since they had been suppressed rather than published, there was legal gray space. His lawyers advised caution. The palace sent formal letters requesting for discretion and reminders of historical sensitivity. But Charles was unmoved. Instead, he scheduled a speech at a memorial fundraiser hosted by the Diana Award, the foundation created in her name. He didn't alert the palace, but when the day came, he stood at the podium with Diana's journal in his hand. He didn't read the most controversial pages, but he read enough, a passage about truth. A note Diana had written in late July 1997, just weeks before her death. "They will try to speak for me, but I have spoken for myself. If you find these words, know they came from my heart, not someone else's pen." The room fell silent. Reporters noted. Cameras flashed. Public reaction was swift and intense the next morning. Diana's first interview with Martin Bashir startled the globe, but this time it was her uncensored private voice. Social media users demanded the recording's release. Palace statements were carefully phrased. They denied covering up, saying the papers were kept to honor her memory and her son's emotional well-being. The public didn't believe it. News shows found ancient footage. Analysts examined how Diana was handled after her divorce, isolated, and how swiftly the palace reshaped her legacy after her death. Camilla, now queen, was criticized again. The tapes didn't assault her, but they revived questions many felt were answered. Anger was directed at silence, domination, and history rewriting. Despite this, Charles Spencer remained cool. He denied interviews. He denied outlets full access. Instead, he returned to Althorpe, where Diana's burial stands on a small island in the water. Flowers and letters were left on the lakeside path by visitors for decades. Charles walked there alone one day. Near the water, he stood, glancing across to his sister's grave. He held the journal's final digitized, protected, and unhidden copy. He didn't talk, but he might have said something basic. My promise was to safeguard them. Now I've shielded you too, since truth always escapes the castle, no matter how powerful. Diana's voice persisted. It only waited. What may Diana have wanted? Do you think Charles Spencer was right to reveal her words? Leave your comments below. Like, share, and subscribe for more. Additionally, click the video below. You'll like.